Hello everyone, and welcome to our debate, A Ragged-Ass Fourth-Rate Country, How and Why the United States Entered the Path to War to Vietnam. First of all, let me thank everyone for joining us on such a beautiful day in this wonderful, wonderful garden of a German house in Rysnov. I would like to tell you that here it is a beautiful day. The weather is fabulous. I have been here for a couple of times already these days, and I have enjoyed the atmosphere and the debates tremendously. I have already begun to feel at home, and I hope that by the end of today's session, you too will feel at home, and that you will decide to join us offline right here in the next years. Also, I would like to thank the organizers for putting together this event, this series of events during such trying times. And having said that, I welcome also the public here, and maybe you will notice, as I have noticed, a dog visiting us from time to time. Don't worry, it doesn't bite, it doesn't bark, and he or she is welcome to join. So let's get to more, let's say, serious business now. Let me introduce myself. My name is Raluca Cîmpean, and I'm a PhD graduate of Heidelberg University, a former visiting professor at Tufts University and the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And currently, I am an associate lecturer at Transylvania University. My special thanks today go to Professor Manfred Berg, Kurt Engelhorn Chair in American History at the University of Heidelberg, whose vast area of expertise in American history and culture make him the perfect choice for a speaker about the intricate decision-making process about Vietnam and the US military involvement in Vietnam. He is joining us online. Then we have Professor Virgiliu Ţârău from the History and Philosophy Department of Babeș-Bolyai University, an expert in contemporary world history, Cold War history, and the history of the communist regime in Romania. And last but not least, I thank Professor Lucian Dîrdală for joining us also online from Iași. He's a lecturer at the European Studies Center in Iași, as I mentioned. One detail that I would like to mention about the setup of today's debate is that we will proceed with Professor Berg's lecture on the topic I have just announced, and then Professor Ţârău and Professor Dîrdală will have their chances to comment, ask questions, and in one word, respond. And last but not least, our public here, our offline public, is more than welcome to join with comments and questions. So having said that, Professor Berg, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Raluca, for this kind introduction. Thanks to the organizers for including me in this program. Obviously, I deeply regret that I cannot be with you in person today, but I think we all understand and agree that in these uncertain times it is necessary to act responsibly. And as you just said, I trust that there will be another opportunity to visit you in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, when my former student, Dr. Raluca Cîmpean, asked me to give a lecture on how the United States became embroiled in the Vietnam War, she indicated that my talk would complement the showing of the 2002 docudrama, The Path to War, featuring the escalation of U.S. involvement in Indochina during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson between 1965 and 1968. Now, I understand that it is not possible to include the film in the festival. However, I trust that some of you may have watched the drama or perhaps parts of it. I will therefore make a few references to the film, which I hope are self-explanatory. I should also say that although there is certainly much room for debate about the overall judgments that the film conveys and the portrayal of certain individuals, perhaps most importantly President Johnson, but in general, according to my view, the use of the sources and the quotations in The Path to War appears to be rather accurate. So the movie begins with a sequence on the inaugural ball on January the 20th, 1965, when LBJ celebrates his triumphant electoral victory of the previous November. Although somewhat tongue-in-cheek, the president boasts that never before in American history had there been, quote, such an abundance of brains and talent in one administration. Later in the film, when it has already become clear to him that there is no swift and successful end in sight, Johnson ruminates over the puzzle why America cannot control, quote, a ragged-ass fourth-rate country like Vietnam. These two quotations, I believe, epitomize the Vietnam conundrum, which has kept the American public, as well as historians, busy over the past half-century. Why did the supposedly best and brightest minds of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations involve the United States in a region American foreign policy makers had never before regarded as vital to U.S. national security? Why did Americans fight a protracted war, which cost the lives of nearly 60,000 U.S. soldiers and $175 billion, which would amount to 1.3 trillion in today's prices? And in the end, they were unable to prevail. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War became a key factor in the polarization of American politics and society and in the undoing of the Johnson presidency. Instead of fighting a war on poverty to create a great society with rights, liberty, and opportunity for all, as he had promised in his 1964 presidential campaign, Johnson, in his own words, got involved with that bitch of war in the jungles of Indochina. Eventually, the president's vision fell apart when anti-protesters outside the White House haunted him with the infamous chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Path to War makes much of Johnson's dilemma of having to decide between guns or butter, that is, funding the war in Vietnam or paying for the ambitious social welfare reforms Johnson had planned. Like many historians, the plot portrays LBJ as a tragic figure. But we should not pity Johnson too much, because, as the film also makes clear, the tragedy was of his own making. During the first half of 1965, the Johnson administration took crucial steps to escalate U.S. military involvement in the war, including the bombing of North Vietnam and the deployment of combat troops. There were voices within the administration who warned against the likely consequences. Those included Undersecretary of State George Ball and Presidential Advisor Clark Clifford. Clifford, brilliantly played by actor Donald Sutherland, is a key character in Path to War because his transformation from Dove to Hawk personifies the inexorable logic of escalation. Once the first step had been taken, there was no going back. The next step had to follow. Ultimately, I think the title Path to War is misleading for a docudrama that conveys the years between 1965 and 1968, because, and I think most historians would agree here, The path to war began much earlier than 1965, and the decision for war became more or less irrevocable during the first 7 months of that year. If we wish to fully understand American involvement in Vietnam, we need to take a long-term perspective that goes back in time until the end of the Second World War. And we need to place Vietnam into the broader framework of the Cold War and American strategies of containing the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Like contemporary Americans, historians debate whether Vietnam was a necessary war to contain communist expansion or a misguided intervention in a country that was of marginal significance to US and Western security, let alone economic interest. However, scholars agree on one basic point. Vietnam was not contested between the East and the West because it was important. Rather, it became important because it was contested. For the communist powers, the ability to wage successful wars of liberation in what soon would be called the Third World was central to their claim to lead the masses toward world revolution. Moreover, as in their support for North Korea during the Korean War, showing solidarity with their comrades in North Vietnam was an imperative of proletarian internationalism with major repercussions for the nascent rivalry between Moscow and Beijing. In a similar vein, as soon as American leaders had begun to make commitments to the independence of South Vietnam, the conflict assumed a highly symbolic meaning and put US credibility and prestige on the line. As early as 1965, US decision makers became aware that there was no prospect of military victory in any conventional understanding of the term. Instead, the objective would be to avert defeat in a conflict into which the United States kept pouring ever more troops and money. Johnson refused to be humiliated. He vowed he was not going to lose Vietnam, which would embolden the Chinese and the Soviets and expose him to the attacks of his right-wing critics at home. In order to force the enemy to the negotiating table, US military strategists advocated waging a war of attrition until the North Vietnamese would realize that they could no longer carry on against the vastly superior resources of America. This strategy, I believe, explains the increasing brutality of American warfare, including the obsession with the body count of killed enemy soldiers. US leaders could have known better. In September 1945, Ho Chi Minh, the nationalist leader of the newly established Democratic Republic of Vietnam, presented a Declaration of Independence from France, in which Ho Chi Minh cited the famous line from the American Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and possess the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Emulating Thomas Jefferson, Ho Chi Minh listed the grievances against French colonial rule and claimed the right for Vietnam to be a free and independent country. And I quote, "The entire Vietnamese people are determined to mobilize all their physical and mental strength to sacrifice their lives and property in order to safeguard their independence and liberty." End of quote. In the ensuing war of liberation against the French, who tried to recuperate the former colony they had surrendered to the Japanese in 1940, the Viet Minh, as the Vietnamese nationalist forces were called, proved that these were not empty words. Initially, the Viet Minh had reason to hope for American support. During the Second World War, President Franklin Roosevelt, who had nothing but contempt for French colonial aspirations, had supported the idea that Vietnam should be placed under the United Nations trusteeship as a first step toward independence. However, as the anti-Hitler coalition began to fall apart shortly after Roosevelt's death, FDR's successor Harry Truman assigned top priority to containing Soviet expansionism in Europe and to strengthening America's ties with its Western European allies. Truman assured the French that his administration would recognize the restitution of French sovereignty over Indochina. Moreover, as the Cold War intensified, US foreign policy makers no longer perceived Ho Chi Minh as a legitimate nationalist leader, but as a puppet of the Kremlin. Although the United States had officially remained neutral when hostilities began between the French and the Viet Minh in 1946, the Truman administration supported France through military and financial aid. In 1949 and 1950, the significance of the Indochina theater shifted dramatically from sideshow to geopolitical hotspot. First, China fell to Mao's communist revolution, which caused ripples of shock and anger among the anti-communist right in America. Then, North Korean communist forces launched a surprise attack on South Korea, to which Truman responded with a full-scale military commitment of American troops. Under these circumstances, holding the line in Vietnam appeared vital to safeguard America's position in the Western Pacific and in Southeast Asia. Although the Americans harbored grave doubts about French political wisdom and military resilience, they now threw their weight behind France. In 1950, the US granted diplomatic recognition to the Associated State of Vietnam, the French puppet regime, and promised military support to French Indochina. Over the next 4 years, US aid to the French increased from $130 million to $800 million per year, amounting to 2/3 of the entire French war costs. Yet, American money could not prevent the defeat of the French forces. Between March and May 1954, the Viet Minh encircled the French fortress at Dien Bien Phu in northern Vietnam. When the situation became desperate for the French, Paris asked for US airstrikes to bail out the French troops, but President Dwight D. Eisenhower refused any direct military commitment. There was also strong opposition in Congress. Senator John F. Kennedy, among others, warned that no amount of military aid could conquer an enemy who had the support of the people. Between April and July 1954, an international conference held at Geneva brought together the Viet Minh, the French-controlled Vietnamese government, the neighboring states of Laos and Cambodia, plus the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. The ensuing Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The north would be controlled by the Viet Minh and the south by the non-communist and pro-Western forces until national elections would be held supposedly in 1956. However, neither the United States nor the South Vietnamese government signed the agreement, and the scheduled elections were never held, arguably because most likely they would have elevated Ho Chi Minh to power in all of Vietnam. President Eisenhower had been unwilling to bail out the French, but that did not mean he was ready to concede all of Vietnam to the communists. At a press conference in April 1954, he explained to the public what subsequently would be called the domino theory, and I quote, "You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and that will happen to the last one is a certainty, and it will go over very quickly. So you could have the beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences, end of quote. If Vietnam fell, so would Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, and then the Philippines, Japan, and possibly even Australia and New Zealand. Eisenhower was educating the American people on the premise that would henceforth guide US policy in Indochina. South Vietnam, the remaining pro-Western part of the country, was not important on its own merits, but as a domino in the global containment of communism. Because France was no longer a player, the United States would have to protect South Vietnam. The challenge was to do so without being dragged into the kind of war that had destroyed the French. The Americans were hopeful they could do the job because, unlike French colonialists, they were going to offer a non-communist alternative of development and progress to the people of South Vietnam. So they thought. Over the next 6 years, US policymakers tried to combine the containment of communism with nation building. The Americans placed their hopes in Ngo Dien Diem, a member of the small Catholic elite of Vietnam. Diem became prime minister in June 1954, but soon proved to be a poor choice. The prime minister was a stubborn and reclusive character, and more importantly, he had little backing among Vietnamese elites, let alone among ordinary people. Still, as long as US financial aid was forthcoming, he could buy off opponents. Moreover, US military advisors began training South Vietnamese soldiers, and the Diem government received large amounts of military aid. The CIA set up bases for covert operations to destabilize the North. As US engagement in South Vietnam increased, both the Eisenhower administration and influential members of Congress began to see the country as a key pillar in the strategy of global containment. American leaders no longer viewed anti-colonialism and third world nationalism as legitimate political forces, but as a cover for communist expansion masterminded by the Kremlin. The problem was that no amount of economic and military aid the US gave to the Diem regime could win the South Vietnamese president legitimacy and build an efficient government. Diem's regime was extremely corrupt and nepotistic. Most positions of power and influence were held by family members. And it became increasingly repressive, including the murder of political opponents. The Americans pressed hard for land reform, but to little avail. Most importantly, the majority of the Vietnamese people viewed the Viet Minh as liberators from French colonialism and were opposed to the partition of their country. Despite ongoing repression, a guerrilla movement supported by Hanoi formed among the peasantry. Beginning in 1959, the violence intensified and assumed the character of a civil war. In 1960, the communists took the lead in establishing the National Liberation Front, whose military arm became known as the Viet Cong. The Eisenhower administration realized that Diem was corrupt, autocratic, and unpopular, but saw no alternative to stabilizing his regime by increasing military aid and training. But these measures could not prevent the LLF from gaining control of large parts of the countryside. When John F. Kennedy took over from Eisenhower in January 1961, he faced pressure from Diem for more aid and for US ground troops to back up the South Vietnamese army. Kennedy refused to dispatch combat troops because he feared an open-ended commitment. But he massively increased economic and military aid, as well as the number of military advisors. A task force of 8,000 US troops was acting under cover of providing humanitarian services such as flood relief. Also, unmarked US planes bombed NLF bases and supply lines. In addition, the Americans devised a counterinsurgency program that included a strategy to secure Vietnamese villages, build up an efficient infrastructure, and thus wean the peasantry away from the Viet Cong. In reality, these so-called strategic hamlets were widely seen as an instrument of oppression by the Diem regime. One major reason why most Vietnamese, despite the Diem government, was its favoritism of the country's minority Catholic population and its repression of Buddhism. Buddhist monks served as the leaders of protest, including spectacular acts of self-immolations. Diem dismissed them as communist agents, and his sister-in-law, the infamous Madame Nu, offered to bring matchsticks and fuel to what she called the next barbecue. By the fall of 1963, the Kennedy administration realized that Diem was no longer tenable, although they had no real alternative option. With the encouragement of the US Embassy and the CIA, anti-Diem military officers staged a coup and murdered the president and his brother in early November 1963. Kennedy was appalled. He had wanted Diem removed from office but not killed. As we all know, only 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Years later, JFK apologists planted the story that after the murder of Diem, Kennedy had come to his senses and decided to withdraw the US forces from Vietnam. In fact, plans for a gradual withdrawal were drafted all through 1963, albeit based on the assumption that US troops would no longer be needed because the South Vietnamese army would finally be up to the job. In his last press conference, Kennedy announced that several hundred advisors would be withdrawn until the end of the year. Yet, there is no evidence that JFK planned to leave Vietnam wholesale, for the reason that he considered the American engagement futile and hopeless, and had decided to cut losses regardless of the consequences. To the contrary, in numerous public and confidential statements, Kennedy reaffirmed his belief in the domino theory and his willingness to continue the support of South Vietnam. Whether he would have refused to escalate the war had he lived is, of course, pure speculation. Arguably, JFK had no clear plan what to do should things get worse. It remains an indisputable fact that it was John F. Kennedy who increased the number of US military personnel in Vietnam from roughly 3,000 to almost 17,000. Kennedy not only pumped logistical and financial aid to the South Vietnamese, but also authorized combat missions by US troops, including covert operations against the North. The Kennedy administration at first supported the Diem regime and then okayed a coup. But Diem's death did not bring stability to South Vietnam, as South Vietnamese military leaders kept vying for power and staging one coup after another. When Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn into office on November 22nd, 1963, he had no straightforward plan how to deal with the Vietnam quagmire. His priorities were domestic reforms in the fields of civil rights and social welfare. As I mentioned earlier, LBJ considered it the tragedy of his presidency that Vietnam destroyed both his grandiose vision of the Great Society and his place in history. In early 1964, though, Johnson still did not know and could not know what would ensue. His key concerns were the upcoming elections in November, in which he hoped to win a mandate for his reform agenda. Voters, he figured, would neither like to see the United States become engaged in a full-scale overseas war, nor would they appreciate America to yield territory to world communism. Under these circumstances, LBJ's best bet was to stay put in Vietnam. And yet, in August 1964, Johnson took a fateful step in escalating US military involvement after 2 American destroyers had allegedly been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The US vessel Maddox was positioned in international waters, but had been engaged in a reconnaissance mission. After the ship reported the attack, the US Navy ordered a second destroyer into the area, which then also reported it had come under attack. It has often been suspected that the incidents were fabricated to give Johnson a pretext for asking Congress for broad authority to apply military force in Vietnam. There is little doubt that at least the first attack actually occurred. The second one, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara wrote in his memoirs, may very well have been a figment of the imagination, but he insists that decision makers at the time truly believed it had happened. In retaliation, Johnson ordered the bombing of naval bases and fuel tanks in North Vietnam, the first overt attack against targets in the north by the US Air Force. More importantly, the president used the incident to obtain a congressional resolution which, although not a formal declaration of war, gave virtually unlimited authority to the president to use military force. The Gulf of Tonkin Revolution of August 10, 1964 won unanimous support in the House of Representatives, while only 2 senators voted nay. The resolution asserted that South Vietnam was threatened by communist aggression from the north and that the United States regarded Southeast Asia as vital to its national interest. It authorized the president, quote, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, end of quote. Johnson, with his inimitable sense of humor, joked that the resolution was, quote, like grandma's nightgown. It covers everything. In later years, many members of Congress came to regret that they had signed a blank check and claimed that they had never expected Johnson to use it as the equivalent of a declaration of war. Ironically, in the election campaign of 1964, Lyndon Johnson ran as the peace candidate. The president famously promised that he was, quote, not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves, unquote. His opponent, Republican Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, was an arch conservative and a Cold War hawk who openly talked about using tactical nuclear weapons to win the war in Vietnam. In November, LBJ won in a landslide. He now was president in his own right and had a mandate for his great society. Unfortunately, the Vietnam problem would not go away. To the contrary, the North Vietnamese leadership had read the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as a quasi-declaration of war and concluded that it would have to fight the Americans directly to achieve reunification. Beginning in November 1964, Viet Cong forces started attacking US military installations, killing more and more US servicemen. Both US military commanders and the civilian decision makers on national security, not nearly all of whom were holdovers from the Kennedy years, began pressing for a large-scale bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Johnson was not yet ready, but in late December 1964, South Vietnamese forces suffered a string of humiliating defeats against NLF forces that were inferior in numbers and ill-equipped. With a desertion rate of 10,000 men each month, the South Vietnamese army was in imminent danger of falling apart. To the Americans, it was becoming clear that South Vietnamese would collapse within months unless the United States came to the rescue. In February 1965, the president ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a large-scale campaign of air raids against military targets in North Vietnam. Although the administration publicly claimed that the attacks were limited retaliatory strikes, Rolling Thunder was in fact the beginning of a sustained air offensive. Over the next 3 years, the bombing was expanded and the line between military and civilian targets was increasingly blurred. Eventually, the US Air Force dropped 3 times the tonnage of bombs on Vietnam that it had dropped on Europe during the Second World War. Because US bases in South Vietnam needed better protection, the US commander in Vietnam, General William C. Westmoreland, whom critics later ridiculed as General Wastemoreland, began requesting ground troops that would engage in combat operations against the Viet Cong. US Ambassador in Saigon, Maxwell Taylor, himself a former general, warned against crossing the line toward an open-ended commitment and against engaging in a guerrilla war for which the Americans were not trained. Indeed, after the first Marine units went ashore at Da Nang in March, 40,000 soldiers followed within the next weeks. The escalation of US engagement in the war triggered both domestic and international criticism. Johnson reacted by offering North Vietnamese negotiations, a temporary bombing halt, and a massive program of economic development. But Hanoi insisted on an unconditional withdrawal of the Americans and national reunification. At this critical juncture, the Johnson administration weighed its options. Secretary of Defense McNamara counseled an escalation of the military conflict to demonstrate America's unswerving resolve to prevent the enemy from winning. Eventually, the Viet Cong and North Vietnam would have to accept that they could not conquer the South and agree to a negotiated settlement. In contrast, Undersecretary of State George Ball, who had already opposed military escalation the year before, sent a memorandum to the president, which was shockingly accurate in predicting what was to follow. Sending more combat troops to Vietnam, he observed, would involve the United States in a full-scale war against the VC and North Vietnam. And I quote, "Our troops will bog down in the jungles and rice paddies while we slowly blow the country to pieces." End of quote. Once the US troops would begin to suffer heavy casualties, there would be no way to get out without a national humiliation. It was better, Ball concluded, to cut losses now and seek a diplomatic solution. In a similar vein, presidential advisor Clark Clifford insisted that America could not win the war and that any deeper involvement would lead to a catastrophe. It should also be noted that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and US military commanders in Vietnam were quite skeptical of committing an ever-increasing number of US combat troops to South Vietnam. Even the war hawks in the administration agreed that the chances of defeating the Viet Cong were dim, but they pointed to the geopolitical consequences. In case the US withdraw, South Vietnam would fall quickly and the rest of Indochina would follow. If the US did not honor its commitment in Vietnam, American credibility would be ruined and communist aggression would be encouraged worldwide, including Berlin. General Westmoreland asked for increasing the number of US troops from 75,000 to 175,000. The president's advisors emphasized that it was just the beginning and that perhaps up to 600,000 US soldiers would be needed. One of Johnson's civilian counsels warned the president, quote, "This could be a quagmire, an open-ended commitment without a realistic hope of ultimate victory," end of quote. Still, LBJ granted the requests of his military. However, he shied away from confronting the American people with the truth. In his public announcements, the president did not reveal the exact numbers of the troop increase and merely noted that additional forces might be needed later. In the summer of 1965, the United States was, for all practical purposes, at war. But there had never been a real public debate over why Americans were fighting in Vietnam and what sacrifices the American people would have to make. In retrospect, Robert McNamara claimed that the decision makers of the Johnson administration, including himself, discussed alternatives but failed to grasp the larger implications of the decisions they took. This argument frankly strikes me as self-serving. As the record clearly bears out, Johnson and his key advisors chose war in spite of their own expectation that it would be extremely costly and very likely end in a stalemate. Historians have exhaustively pondered the motivations that drove this choice. The lessons of history, especially the Munich paradigm, loom large. Appeasement of aggressors will only encourage more aggression. Hence, credibility turned into an article of faith. America had to show to friend and foe that it would not yield. If it did, the domino theory foretold the consequences. Credibility was also personal. JFK and LBJ could not be seen as weak and indecisive. In addition, they kept emphasizing that losing Vietnam, like the loss of China in 1949, would fuel another anti-communist backlash that would hurt their liberal domestic programs. From hindsight, none of these assumptions appear compelling. Even many Cold War traditionalists who agreed with the principle of containing communism, and in this context, we should certainly mention the architect of containment, George F. Kennan, considered American involvement in Vietnam as a case of flawed containment because no vital US interests were at stake. American policymakers, they argued, were blinded by Cold War anti-communism and made their choices from an assessment of global rather than local circumstances, exaggerating the dependency of the Vietnamese communists from both the Soviet Union and Red China. Were there alternatives? Many historians argue that between 1963 and early 1965, the United States might have withdrawn from South Vietnam based on the argument that it could not save a country unwilling to fight for its own freedom. Skeptics such as George Ball and Clark Clifford had recommended such a course. To be sure, the loss of South Vietnam would have triggered harsh criticism from the right, but it is doubtful that in 1964 American voters would have changed their minds because of a country most ordinary people would not have been able to find on a map. Of course, we cannot know what would have happened had Johnson decided to pull out. But we do know that escalating American military engagement brought about exactly what it was supposed to prevent. It dealt a severe blow to America's international credibility and prestige, and it undercut Johnson's domestic legitimacy. The decision to disengage from Vietnam would have required not only courage, but also a coherent strategy that would have combined military and diplomatic means and ends. It would have required to take the enemy seriously and to explore what concessions Hanoi might be willing to make in return for US withdrawal. Most likely, South Vietnam would have been lost all the same. But if the Americans could have bought time, Saigon's failure would not have looked like a humiliating military defeat for the United States. Instead, Johnson and his advisors, locked in groupthink, chose to rely on military power because they simply could not imagine that a fourth-rate country and a bunch of barefoot guerrillas would be able to withstand the formidable might of the US military. Sooner or later, they would have to come to the negotiating table and settle on American terms, that is, forfeiting the goal of conquering the South. Over the next 3 years, Johnson kept offering negotiations based on conditions that assumed the preponderance of US military power. Alas, Hanoi refused to budge. Like the Americans, the North Vietnamese pursued a strategy of attrition based on the calculation that the American public would grow tired of the war and would not tolerate increasing numbers of GIs returning home in body bags. To be sure, the price for the Vietnamese people was horrendous. The strategy of North Vietnamese leaders was based on a near limitless readiness to sustain military and civilian casualties, just as Ho Chi Minh had declared in his 1945 Declaration of Independence. In retrospect, their calculation proved correct. In contrast, the Americans reluctantly walked down the path to war without a straightforward commitment to military victory. As the skeptics had warned, the United States gradually sank deeper and deeper into the Vietnam quagmire. In later years, American military and political leaders argued that the United States must learn the lessons from Vietnam. It must never again wage war without a manifest threat to vital national security interests, without a clearly defined and attainable objective, without an exit strategy, and without broad domestic support. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, however, the George W. Bush administration started 2 wars against Afghanistan and Iraq that increasingly came to resemble Vietnam in several respects. First, the Americans commanded a vast preponderance of military power, but were unable to control and defeat insurgents in asymmetrical warfare. Second, the justification of the wars was linked to a project of nation building, but the legitimacy of the pro-American regimes in Kabul and Baghdad was fragile for similar reasons as that of the regimes of South Vietnam. And third, although 9/11 had a powerful short-term effect of rallying Americans around the flag, the American public soon grew tired of waging what critics began to call the forever wars. Once again, Americans found out the hard way that it is easy to begin a war against fourth-rate countries, but very difficult to end them. I thank you for your attention, and I'm very interested in hearing your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Berg, for your insightful and engaging lecture. I'm sure all of us here have comments and questions, but before the audience gets a chance to intervene, I would like to ask Professor Dîrdală to offer his own thoughts on the matter. Oh, and not to forget, we're also taking questions and comments from our online audience. So, Professor Dîrdală.
Thank you very much. Is it all right, the sound?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me at this conference, even from my hometown of Iași, but I'm very much linked to Râșnov because Eu sunt Brașovean. I am from Brașov in a sort of way. My mother was born in Brașov, and I spent there much of my childhood. So it's a double pleasure for me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation.
First of all, let me thank the professor for his very, very informative and interesting presentation. It was a pleasure for me to find a certain interference between the work and the perspective of the historian and the perspective of the political scientist. It raised questions, and I will start by stating some of the questions that I have been stimulated to ask following this presentation. First of all, I would like to dwell at the dominant theory and to argue that perhaps they have had a sort of embedded domino theory. So we saw it in Eisenhower's time, we saw it in Kennedy's time, and then Lyndon Johnson took it over. So why do I put this forward? Because I tend to see wars like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan from a structural realist perspective. So I tend to believe that structural factors, especially the Cold War, the superpower rivalry, power and ideological rivalry, strongly influenced the outlook of the major players of various American administrations. And although they differed very much in terms of domestic policy projects or in terms of international outlook, they somehow tended to succumb to this relative gains logic. If you believe that any loss, no matter how important that territory is for your country, is a loss in a bigger play, in the superpower play, in an ideological play, you are constrained. So what I see, and somehow the presentation was strengthened this idea. I think Professor Berg argued that people from various fields of international relations, political science, tended to see escalation as the minimum loss strategy, tended to see it and to believe it was the preferable strategy. And of course, this ended with Nixon. The Nixon administration took a more radical step. So somehow, I would like to dwell on that because this also helps us to make the comparison with Iraq or Afghanistan, because Afghanistan, I will start with Iraq because it's Iraq 1990 first, and then Iraq 2002, 2003, and the following years. So in 1990 and 2002, we didn't have that bipolar logic, that constraining logic in which a loss was necessarily the opponent's gain. So somehow, as Professor Berg argued, for George H.W. Bush, as well as for George W. Bush, that those were wars of choice. And of course, people make the difference between the very, very cautious approach in the 1991 war, 1990-1991 crisis, and of George Bush the father, and the more ideologically driven and assertive attitude by his son, by President George W. Bush. So somehow, maybe we can say that the Vietnam influence was stronger in 1990 than it was in 2002. But anyway, the main point is that those constraining factors were no longer there. And these wars, the wars of my generation, 1990, 2000, were much more war of choice. So this is not a way of excusing people or of being too mild on people making bad choices in various American administrations. The benefit of hindsight is obvious for us. But those people, I think, felt they were going to lose important points in the bipolar competition. Now, I would like to go to the domestic politics, foreign policy, security policy conundrum, and of course, the movie is very persuasive in this respect. President Johnson, as well as other American leaders, are concerned mainly with, or are very much concerned with re-election. I would say that to this, for Lyndon Johnson, this is the harshest choice. It was not so harsh for Eisenhower, who of course begins the political involvement, for Kennedy, during whose time America actually begins military operations, but it is harsh for Lyndon Johnson. And yes, he tries to do the right thing in the sense that he would have liked to avoid this involvement in order to pursue his domestic goals. But he felt like I do not speak German, but this is the Primat der Außenpolitik. Foreign policy and security policy comes first. And sometimes this is a mistake. Sometimes maybe it's better to listen to what most of your people would like to say, to voices of civil society, to voices of advisors. And Johnson was not able to do that. So somehow again, security policy, domestic politics, how do you solve this riddle, and how do you prevent the trap of doing foreign and security policy things because of domestic electoral concerns? And I think Lyndon Johnson was not able to do that. And of course, again, the Nixon administrations cut the Gordian knot and accepted defeat. I would also like to stress another point that Professor Berg's presentation made me reflect upon. That is the military, the role of the military in such crisis. Historians do not like what-if questions, and we political scientists do not like it very much either. But what if MacArthur instead of Westmoreland, and so on and so forth? The point is, of course, that you have to be sensitive to the historical context. The Korean War is different. The Korean War is waged in an atmosphere, in an atmosphere of threat, of maybe overstressing ideological and political threat, and it's waged much more conclusively. Vietnam is not, the Vietnam situation is not similar. Many more constraints hindered American war effort in Vietnam as compared to Korea, in my view. And this, of course, this was about to go on, and Afghanistan, Iraq are somehow similar. It's maybe the first important war that America, as Professor Berg noticed, America's aim was not winning, but preventing its opponent from winning. And of course, this makes a lot of difference. And if you go into nation building, and if you stress the nation building goals as war goals, if you stress such things, of course, the chances to lose the war increases, to lose the peace increase. So it's ominous. It has been an ominous situation. I would also like to argue about certain issues that they do not prevent, but should make us cautious as far as the comparison between the Vietnam War and Afghanistan and Iraq is concerned. It's about legitimacy first, the legitimacy of the opponent. Before talking about the legitimacy of American involvement and American gains, let us notice that in the late 40s and then the 50s and the 60s, in a territory like Vietnam, the legitimacy of the communist rebellion and the communist movement was rather high. We can't comment here why it was so, but it was rather high. So somehow the difficulty of fighting mobilized people, mobilized collectivity was extremely hard, and the French failed, and the Americans failed eventually. But I don't think this is the case in either Afghanistan or Iraq. No matter how skeptical one could be about the chances of a peaceful solution in Afghanistan, of something that would not resemble the collapse of the Najibullah regime after the end of the Soviet intervention, I don't think that the legitimacy of the rebellion, let me say, Taliban rebellion, is as high as the legitimacy of the Viet Cong and, of course, of North Vietnam was among the South Vietnamese population. I may be wrong, but I think a comparison would be interesting. And of course, if we speak about post 2002, 2003 Iraq, which is of course divided on religious and ethnic lines, it is also highly debatable that the opponent has such a persuasive legitimacy. So somehow this is why the game is still on in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, while in Vietnam, from a temporal perspective, the defeat, America's political defeat, came much earlier. The war in Iraq. Okay, the crisis in Iraq goes on for 18 years, and of course the American intervention, direct intervention in Vietnam, did not last that long. Those were some thoughts about the historical analogies, because of course the Munich analogy, Professor Berg, you spoke about this Munich analogy that somehow constrained the minds of many of LBJ's advisors. And of course it had done so in the Suez crisis in France and Britain, and fortunately President Eisenhower was cool enough to avoid an intervention, a direct intervention. And of course, we use the Munich analogy. People use the Munich analogy to explain Saddam Hussein and the reactions against Saddam Hussein. The Munich analogy, I think, is a dangerous toy in the hands of political decision makers. Far from trying to minimize or to overlook the fact that history does teach us lessons. I think that each situation should be judged according to its own context and calculations of risks and benefits and so on. I would like to finish with another small observation. I think that it's important also to see the analogy between the societal reactions in the time of the Vietnam War and in our times, in, let me say, the Iraq crisis, in the aftermath of the Iraqi crisis. And somehow the Vietnam reactions, which inspired a lot of interesting cultural phenomena. People try to replicate to a certain extent this very creative environment, protest environment, and in my view, the 2002 crisis, the Iraq crisis, was not able to inspire such a creative push. I believe Vietnam stands alone in terms of societal relevance and in terms of the feelings that war, which is of course much more large scale than the Iraq war ever was in terms of American involvement. And somehow we still live with the inheritance, the cultural inheritance of the Vietnam War. These were my brief thoughts, and again I thank Professor Berg. It was an extremely interesting presentation, and I will certainly use some of its ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dîrdală. Now, before we're taking questions from the audience and comments. I understand we lost the connection with Professor Ţârău. So, excuse me? Okay, so I will have my own brief comments and questions for both Professor Berg and Professor Dîrdală. I'm hoping the connection with Professor Berg is still working.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I would like to address a concept that you mentioned and that the docudrama Path to War manages to dramatize so masterfully, the concept of the domino theory, which explained very much the containment policy for everyone to understand. And I was reminded of an interview that Kennedy gave on September 3rd, 1963, so less than 2 months before his assassination. Walter Cronkite interview, in which one of the key questions was what should be the course of action the U.S. should take with regards to South Vietnam. And it was baffling for me, and not just for me, to notice his two answers, which were poles apart and in the course of a couple of minutes. First of all, he said, well, it's their war, they should be the ones to win it or lose it, but let's not forget that if Vietnam goes communist, then the whole of Asia would turn communist and Berlin would be threatened, so on and so forth. So the U.S. involvement is not only necessary, but required. LBJ too rehearses the same argument, and I can think of another interview, this time an LBJ interview, in which in his unmistaken style, he explained to the audience that, well, if this little nation goes down, ask yourselves what would happen to those other little nations. And President Kennedy didn't lose Vietnam. I would not lose Vietnam either. So this leads me to my question. How much did presidents in general, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, how much did presidents get to decide at the time, and to what extent were they prisoners of the general foreign policy mindset? This is one question, and a short follow-up to the question would be that which was, at the end of the day, which was the last domino piece to fall? One of those little countries in Asia, or Berlin even, or was it the presidency itself? This is a question for both guests.
Yeah. May I briefly respond to Professor Dîrdală? I can't address all the important issues that he raised, and also I think we have quite a few agreements. In terms of the search for alternatives by historians, I'm actually quite interested in what-if questions, although they do have their limits. I'm skeptical in terms of what we might call retrospective optimism by scholars to solve the problems of the past. So my interest is always, can I find in the sources, can I find debates, can I find in the record discussions that indicate that there was a situation when alternatives were seriously considered and then choices were made and paths were taken. And I believe that in 1964, 1965, we do have such a situation. Of course, we then need to analyze why people such as Lyndon Johnson, McNamara, and others chose war. And I think what both Professor Dîrdală and Dr. Cîmpean have just mentioned, these are explanations that I think carry us quite a long way. Nevertheless, I think it is important to point out that these debates were there, that it was not just a situation of the blind leading the blind. My analogies, particularly those at the end of my talk about the Afghanistan and the Iraq wars, I do see a certain difference between the war against Afghanistan in 2001 and the war against Iraq in 2003. I think the war in Afghanistan had legitimacy both domestic and internationally, because it was clear that the Taliban regime had given aid and comfort to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And from that point of view, it is hard to debate that the United States had a cause for going to war. Iraq, in contrast, in my view, 2003 was a purely war of choice. So Professor Dîrdală rightly asks whether, or points out that it did not trigger the same kind of protest movement that the Vietnam War did, which is of course correct. I think one of the reasons for this may be seen in the changes in the American military regime. The fact that the Vietnam War was mostly fought, at least until the late 1960s, early 1970s, by draftees, played a major role. We now have a professional U.S. Army, and it would be an interesting question to debate how this fact plays into the ability to deploy forces and wage war overseas. Nevertheless, in the long run, I think it is also interesting to note that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and their inconclusive nature have strengthened the neo-isolationism that eventually played in the cards of Donald Trump. As to Raluca Cîmpean's question, I believe we need to take into consideration that the decision makers at the time did indeed believe in the domino theory. It was not just a cover for other ulterior motives or interests. They firmly believed in it. And as to your question, what was the ultimate domino to fall? Obviously, the loss of China loomed very large in the background. It is clear that both Kennedy and Johnson feared that if they were to be accused of having lost another outpost against world communism, this would trigger a new wave of McCarthyite anti-communist hysteria. Whether this is warranted or not is open to debate, but I do think it was on their. It played a role in their calculations, and therefore must be taken seriously.
And I also believe that LBJ as well as JFK took into account that or believed that it was not in their party's best interest to quote-unquote lose Vietnam, because it was Truman, if I'm not mistaken, another Democrat, who quote-unquote lost China. Again, the image preoccupation and obsession, along with the, of course, strategic reasons that they had in the decision-making process. Professor Dîrdală, is there any comment that you would like to make or question to ask at this point?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it's a comment that turns out to be a question. I do not have information about the inner workings. This is not my field. The inner workings of the Johnson administration. Of course, I listened very carefully to Professor Berg's presentation. What strikes me as odd is that some of those people, not Johnson, we know Johnson was not there, were involved in the debates over the reactions against in the Cuban crisis. Yes. So there, the Kennedy administration somehow manages to create a ground where groupthink is avoided or minimized, and opinions are exchanged. As far as I understand, the Johnson administration was not able to do this, and it would be interesting for me to know if this is true, if my perception is correct, and perhaps why couldn't it happen now?
But I think that's an extremely intriguing question. My take from the debate during the Cuban crisis of 1962 Two is that there was a different set. There were many other things. Of course, there was the threat of starting a nuclear war, which is quite a different level of military violence compared to Vietnam. But what I find intriguing as a historian is the type of historical analogy that the decision makers were using. In 1962, there were two analogies looming large. One was August 1914, and the other was Pearl Harbor. And August 1914, obviously, we might get into a major, supposedly, Kennedy had just read The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. And we're getting into a world catastrophe without us or the other guys really wanting this to happen. So let's be careful not to take any steps from which we cannot go back. And there's also when the military advisors demand that the U.S. Air Force begins bombing Cuba, I think it was Bobby Kennedy who argued that that would be a Pearl Harbor in reverse, and that they should not be prepared to take the responsibility for that. Whereas in the Vietnam setting, it is the Munich and the entire discourse about appeasement that looms large. And well, in an aside, in parentheses, I should say that it is one of the most important tasks that we as scholars face is to shell out the meaning of history and the applicability of these analogies, because it is always very good and well to say we have to learn the lessons of history, but what are the lessons? What are the lessons of history? In the case of Vietnam, you could also argue that the lessons of history would have been to think twice and to think of other cases that when perhaps not necessarily the First World War, but obviously the fear that that small causes may have vast consequences.
Thank you. If I may comment on these analogies issues and the Cuban relation to it, I would like to bring in the Bay of Pigs, and which is a recurrent issue throughout Path of War. And President Lyndon Johnson laments how JFK did the opposite to what he was advised, and he refused to do what the majority of his advisors advised him to do, and still his approval rates went up. Whereas in his case, he laments that the situation is the opposite. But what he fails to notice, or he refuses to admit, is that JFK took a huge leap when he followed his own judgment, and that he also took the blame for what happened there. I was wondering to what extent is it fair to make the analogy between JFK and the Bay of Pigs and LBJ and Vietnam with regards to escalation. And while I'm waiting for an answer to this question, I would like the audience to make their comments or ask their questions. And I would like to also say that we had a comment question from Ruxandra Ivan online, which I believe has already been addressed by Professor Berg's and Professor Dîrdală's comments. I hope so. Regarding the Bay of Pigs, is there any worth in bringing this topic into discussion? Is it relevant, or is it just another virtual question, a virtual history type of comment?
I do think it is relevant, but we should not be too easy on JFK. We should not forget that he at first okayed the invasion, trusting in what his military advisors and political advisors told him. However, he was, and I think that must go to his credit, he was eventually capable of stepping on the brakes and not let the situation get out of control. And I think in that respect, I think he is, this was superior decision making over LBJ's, what I think was a rather reckless type of exploiting the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There was nothing, I believe, personally, I believe in 1964, Johnson was extremely popular. He was running against an extremely unpopular arch-conservative, widely seen as an extremist. He had a lot of political capital to spend, plus he could always say, Vietnam is not my war. It's the war that other former presidents had the engagement, but now we're taking a new look at it. This is what Ball, what Clifford tell him, and that this would also bolster his domestic political situation. Johnson decides otherwise, and I think eventually then he the so-called tragedy is a tragedy of his own making.
Right. Thank you, Professor Berg. If there isn't any comment or answer from Professor Dîrdală, let's have a question from the audience.
Okay, so hello everyone. So I have a set of 3 questions. What event in the war convinced the top brass of the United States Armed Force that the war was lost? Was it the Tet Offensive of 1968 or another ulterior event? How effective was the North Vietnamese propaganda in South Vietnam as far as portraying the United States forces as an invading force? And how much of a role did the anti-war sentiments that developed back in the United States played in convincing the armed forces that the war was unwinnable, either in the front lines, in the perception of the soldiers, or on the upper echelon of U.S. leadership? Thank you.
The first question, as I've tried to point out in my talk, the military and political decision makers knew by 1965 that this would be a kind of war in which there would not be a conquest in the sense, in any conventional sense. The Tet Offensive, although it was a military defeat for the Viet Cong forces, I think that's what most historians would agree on, dealt a severe blow, perhaps the decisive blow. There's this famous line by Walter Cronkite, I thought we were winning this damn war. And it was Johnson's reaction to it, his offering of negotiations and his retreat from the presidency. I think they mark a turning point in that respect. As to the effectiveness of North Vietnamese propaganda, I'm not a specialist in this field, but it seems to me that if you look at the more immense losses that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces sustained. One of my students once wrote in a piece that there was an endless commitment to bloodshed on the part of the North Vietnamese. And for a civilian and military population to sustain such sacrifices, I think, requires a lot of commitment. Whether it was a commitment to the communist ideology, I doubt. It was probably Vietnamese nationalism. As to your third question, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. I don't think the interwar period played a particular reason. I do think more it was Americans in the post-war era. They had defeated Nazi Germany. They had defeated Japan. They had a clear preponderance of military power. They were a nuclear superpower. I think there was this type of arrogance of power that simply made it inconceivable that a fourth-rate, ragged-ass country would eventually not have come to terms.
So
we have a clarification for the third question.
yeah, no, so I was referring to the anti-war sentiments that have developed at home. I was not referring to the interwar period. So what effect did the anti-war protests in the US play in...
Anti-Vietnam War.
Yeah, anti-Vietnam War. Yeah, play in demoralizing the troops in the front lines or the upper echelons of U.S. leadership?
I think we really have to. We should not buy too much into the anti-war movement's romantic recollections. The Vietnam War did not become widely unpopular before 1968. And even afterwards, a majority of Americans were very much averse to the idea that the United States would leave humiliated and in defeat. So once they understood that the war could not be won, or that the leadership lacked the resolve to win it, then the way out would be peace with honor. It should also be noted that once the Nixon administration began withdrawing the U.S. combat troops, and it did it quite quickly after 1970, the demonstrations began to subside. It is perhaps a bit cynical to say so, but as soon as most young American men were no longer threatened by being sent to Vietnam, the anti-war movement lost momentum.
Thank you, Professor Berg. Is there any other question? Or we have another question.
Thank you. So thank you, Professor Berg and Professor Dîrdală for the presentations. First, when I was reading the schedule for today and I saw the title of the presentation, I was a little bit amazed. But then I saw the movie Professor Berg recommended, and I understood why the presentation was entitled like this. And my question is about President Johnson. Why do you think he wouldn't have accepted to run for another term? Was it to emphasize his message of starting negotiations, or was there something else behind this motive? Thank you.
I believe that he understood that his chances for re-election would be dim, that his entire presidency had been a failure. He understood that his grandiose vision of a great society that would have put him on the same plane as Franklin Delano Roosevelt lay in shambles. And in that sense, he drew the consequences. I think he deserves credit for this. It was at least a recognition that his presidency had been a failure, and at this point he should simply do what he still could do, unburdened by a domestic campaign for re-election.
Thank you. Actually, this last question was, I would have asked it probably in a bit nuanced terms, but it was on my mind as well. I was thinking in line of virtual history. Could he have won the presidency for a second term and been more instrumental in de-escalating the U.S. involvement in South Vietnam? But I guess this is something that we can only speculate on. Any more questions, comments? Well, if not, I would like to thank you, our guests, to thank you all and thank our guests, Professor Berg and Professor Dîrdală, for joining us today and illuminating us with regards to still a hot topic, the Vietnam War. Thank you for your contributions, and let's all enjoy the day, the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
It was a great pleasure. It was a great pleasure having the discussion. It was a great pleasure seeing you. And again, I hope that at some point in the future, we will have the opportunity to meet in person. Until then, stay well.
You too. Thank you. That's our hope as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dîrdală.
To listen to Professor Berg's presentation. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you all.